So welcome everyone to HELSUS Brown Bag Lunch series. We have today a very interesting topic and format for our discussion. Our topic today is our extractive age, exploring extractivism. And the presented research today is co-authored work by Chris Channon, Francesco Durante, Sofia Hagolani Albo, Sana Hokkanen, and Markus Kröger, and it's based on forthcoming Routledge book on our extractive age, expressions of violence and resistance. And we have three presenters here, Sofia and Will Laffer and Chris Channon will present the research. We have also not only one, but two brilliant discussants, Anja Nygren, a professor of global development studies, and Anna Varvolov-Meera, postdoctoral researcher from Faculty of Arts and HELSUS. I'd like to now give floor to Sofia, who will introduce us to the topic. We have then Will and Chris will present research, and then we have a discussant's turn, and we will have also time for general discussions. So please welcome. The screen is yours, Sofia.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We are so happy to be at this Brown Bag Lunch today with HELSUS, and we're really excited to share our work with you. Before we get into the kind of meat of the chapters, I wanted to take a quick moment to introduce the Exult Initiative, which helped to catalyze the development of these chapters. If you have not heard of it before, the Global Extractivisms and Alternatives Initiative began, which we call Exalt, that's our acronym, began in 2019 at the University of Helsinki. Exalt offers a platform for discussing global extractivisms and their transformative alternatives from different viewpoints, and for gathering and distributing the most recent understanding of the dynamics of extractivisms and how to transform them in order to build more just and sustainable futures. For more information about Exalt or to join our mailing list and hear about our activities, you can visit us at www.exaltpistafi or .fi, which I'll also put down in the chat as soon as I finish this little bit. We have a robust and active mailing list and also social media, so we encourage anybody who is interested in extractivisms or alternatives, or talking about them, or hearing about the latest research that's going on in them, to please give us a follow or a like. We have lots of exciting activities coming up in 2021. And yeah, like I said, we all met through Exalt, and that is how we got this opportunity to write these really lovely book chapters. I'm a little biased though, so forgive me on that one. I think they're lovely. But I think that's enough about Exalt. Hopefully we'll see some of the people here in the future at some of our other Exalt events and interacting with us. And I'd like to turn the floor over to Will for all the stuff you guys actually came to hear about.
Okay, thank you, Sofia. Let me just share my screen here. And okay, can everyone see that? Okay.
Yes.
So I'll briefly begin by introducing the opening chapter of the book that these two chapters are part of, and this provides a general overview and definition of extractivism. Our chapter, which is written by Francesco Durante, Markus Kröger, and Will Lafleur, myself, the chapter proceeds in three parts. So the first part examines the etymological roots of the terms extraction and extractivism. And the second part traces the historical trajectories of global extractivist ontologies and how they characterize the modern world system. Then in the final section, in order to highlight potential alternatives, we draw attention to the on-the-ground resistances to extractivist modes of operation, which we call extractivism, where activism is in all capital letters. And we suggest ways forward in researching and analyzing extraction, global extractivisms, and violence. So yeah, we start by asserting that extractivism characterizes the modern era. So we define extractivism in this publication as a particular way of thinking and the properties and practices organized towards the goal of maximizing benefit through extraction, which brings in its wake violence and destruction. And one of the main points we argue in the chapter is that although extractivism is a feature and even an imperative of capitalism, the extractivist ontologic, as we call it, that we identify is not a feature only of capitalism or neoliberal capitalism, but is rather an underlying way of relating to the world. So seeing extractivism as an ontology that underwrites particular modes of being and relating allows for a more nuanced understanding of the logics that feature prominently in the modern world system, but have also featured as the imperatives of empire for millennia. So in the first section, we attempt to clarify the usage of terms such as extraction and extractivism, which have appeared in a lot of recent literature. And we address these are Latin-derived terms, and we conclude by saying that the specific act of extraction, which can imply removal by force and is accompanied often by some kind of unwillingness, or a removal of one part of a whole. So extraction is different from, but a prerequisite for the concept of extractivism, which can be understood, extractivism can be understood as a constellation of logics and drivers that operationalize extraction. So analyzing the etymology of these terms kind of sheds light on the intrinsically violent nature of extraction, but also for the resistance to extractivisms. So that the agency of peoples who are violently affected by these processes. Then in the second section, we kind of take a historical route to challenge this supposed naturalness or this universalizing character of extractivist ontologies. So we show that, in fact, this extractivist ontologic is rooted in a historical trajectory based on a particular philosophical and cultural tradition. So namely, this is ancient Greece, starting with Aristotle, but then into ancient Rome, and then it's brought by Christianity into the Renaissance and European colonial periods. So this is identified by examining the ontological assumptions of this notion of natural law. So the notion of natural law developed in Greece. It was operationalized as a fundamental assumption in legal doctrines in ancient Rome, and it equates the idea of property with one's humanity. So thus, property and one's humanity is established through the exploitation of things in the natural world, that is, by one's labor. So for example, turning a tree into a chair is a way of exploiting that tree, and that chair then thus becomes your property. So natural law relies already on a particular assumption about property and ownership. And significantly, these assumptions about property don't feature in many non-Western ontologies, and indeed did not feature in most ontologies of the ancient world, other than some of the empires of the ancient world. And even maybe that's debatable, but anyway, the Roman legal systems were, as they were reified in early Renaissance and the European colonial expansion began to heat up, this law was tweaked to suit the purposes of expanding empires. And interestingly, the natural law code, or the law of the first taker, or law of wild beasts, as it was called, it was initially used to argue against colonization. So to argue that indigenous Americans, for example, had established their humanity through their labor. They had exploited their land. But the imperatives of empire, in this case, the English, helped along by John Locke, they argued that the indigenous Americans had not properly exploited the lands where they lived. And thus, legally, indigenous Americans had no rights to claim their land as property. And that created a legal opening for the possibility of colonizing the Americas by force. So this interpretation, of course, required a systematic way of subjugating these non-Europeans as less than. And no surprise, this is This is also about the time that theories of race and racial superiority and inferiority begin to develop in Europe. So this is the turning point that sort of marks a new and more violent era of this extractivist logic. And it provides a rich engine that has justified free labor through enslavement for capitalist development to continue. So development of and transition to capitalist systems relies heavily on this particular ontologic as it developed from the ancient world, where it was imbued with particular assumptions about property, and through its racializing turn to justify colonial empire and enslave supposed underclass in the building of wealth, that has become the capitalist and the modern world systems we live in today. So the final third section of the chapter aims to kind of highlight alternatives to this extractivist ontologic. So we draw attention to the fact that there's always been resistance to this colonial or empire expansion, but we highlight in the chapter that these resistances are becoming louder, becoming more visible in the face of the destruction of life on the planet. And we highlight some of the key strategies that are used, whether it ranges from using bodies, blockades, lawsuits, or intervention by activist institutions. But we kind of suggest that they all rely on distinct place-based affinities. And these place-based affinities are viewed by protesters as non-commensurable, non-commodifiable. And in that way, these practices aim to challenge the ontoepistemic logics of extractivism at the very sources of their material manifestations. So yeah, now I've highlighted the kind of historical trajectories, but there are of course new manifestations that continue to alter the way this logic works and expresses itself. And this is where I'll finish and give the floor to Chris, who will introduce the other chapter we've written on digital extractivisms and what this means for the concept of extractivism, the way extractivist violence changes when it moves from natural resource extraction of forests or mountains to apparently virtual or digital realm that's often found at the desk or in the pocket of your jacket and accessed via the fingertips. So Chris.
Everyone, thank you very much, Will. I guess, yeah, I pre-recorded this. I'm Chris Shagnon. There we go. Welcome, everyone. In this presentation, we're going to go over some of the important points from each of the sections of the paper, Extractivism at Your Fingertips. Since we don't have a lot of time, let's jump in. For our purposes here, the most important thing that we talk about is the concept of total extractivism, or the world eater, from Dunlap and Jacobson. This focuses on how increasingly interconnected different types of extractivisms have become, how they serve to reinforce each other, speed up and intensify each other, and push the boundaries of extractivism into new, previously uncharted areas. The World Eater is, quote, centered on the deployment of violent technologies aiming at integrating and reconfiguring the Earth and absorbing its inhabitants, meanwhile normalizing its logics, apparatuses, and subjectivities as it violently colonizes and pacifies various natures, end quote. Data extractivism fits in very neatly with this, serving to drive and intensify other extractivisms, going into new areas where we ourselves are the resource, and also serving as a form of social pacification itself. We begin by looking at a taxonomy of digital extractivisms, because data is digital, but it is not the only type of potential digital extractivism, and they are rather different. First is data extractivism. The resource being extracted is personal data. The mode of extraction is varied. It can be internet usage, social media, geo-tracking, among many other things. These data points are collected, combined, and packaged to be used or sold. The people profiting are big tech companies, data brokers, and anybody who's producing the infrastructure that goes into this. Next, there's gold farming, which takes place in massively multiplayer online games. The resources being extracted are currency, items, and characters. The way this happens is by individuals working for extremely long periods of time playing these games to collect these resources and then sell them for real money. Finally, there's cryptocurrency mining, and the object of extraction is cryptocurrencies, such as Bitcoin. The mode of extraction is very large numbers of energy-intensive computer banks working on compiling complicated algorithms to create cryptocurrency coins. The people profiting from this are the owners of the computer banks. Looking at how data extractivism is connected to natural resource extractivism, we first ask, what is data? According to Coldrea Mejias, data is information flows that pass from human life in all its forms to infrastructure for collection. This chart is a visualization of the web of connections between data extractivism and natural resource extractivism. The arrows indicate lines of dependence. So, data extractivism is dependent on digital infrastructure. Digital infrastructure is dependent on consumer products, physical infrastructure, and energy, and so on. Look at the terms. First, we have digital infrastructure. These are the things that capture, bundle, and transmit the data, such as apps, websites, and operating systems. Next, we have consumer products. These are the objects that digital infrastructure uses to capture the data. This includes phones, computers, surveillance cameras, smart devices, and home assistants like Amazon Alexa, and so on. Next is physical infrastructure, and of course that varies depending on what you are talking about. For digital infrastructure, that can be things like servers, satellites. For consumer products, it can be power lines, as well as fiber optic cables. For energy, it can be power line and power plants. And finally, for transportation, we're talking about the way that these other things travel. This includes, but is not limited to, cargo ships, planes, and trucks. Data extractivism itself is built upon fundamental violences. One of the major ones is the idea that there is no real consent in these devices by design. The end-user license agreements and terms of service are designed to be extremely long and complicated so that people don't want to read them and they don't understand what they're agreeing to. Even if you can see and understand all the scary things that are snuck into a terms of service, there is no legal recourse. And generally speaking, there are no real alternatives. Beyond this, there's also issues of what we could call social pollution. This includes the fact that these apps are designed to be addictive. This comes not only from scientific studies, but also from people who worked at these companies. Related to this is how the desire to keep people engaged leads to the creation of echo chambers. This makes it very easy to cut off people of different viewpoints and turn them into faceless others. It also makes it a lot easier to find information which just agrees with your point of view and ignore, or perhaps even be hostilely against, factual information that disagrees with your point of view. We've seen how this can become a breeding ground for conspiracies and can lead to things such as QAnon and violence in the real world, like the attack on the US Capitol building. The concept of data violence, also called algorithmic violence, is related to Galtung's concept of structural violence. It is how automated AI decision-making can perpetuate and deepen structural and societal violences such as inequality, segregation, racism, and sexism. There are numerous examples. If this wasn't a serious topic, I would have the yakety sax going. There are studies of how AI decision-making in health and social support from governments can disproportionately hurt the ability of impoverished communities to access those services. In the planning of, quote, smart cities, AI has recreated discriminatory housing policies and de facto segregation. There are numerous types of crime prediction software based on faulty, incomplete, and racist data of the past being used by numerous police departments around the world, effectively just justifying racial profiling and police harassment of minorities. There's Google facial recognition AI tagging pictures of black people as gorillas. Amazon had AI that would identify impulse buyers and automatically raise prices of products on them. Amazon's facial recognition AI misidentified 28 members of the US Congress as being people from publicly available mugshots, and this was disproportionately Black and Latino members of Congress. China provides an excellent example of data violence in real life, though this is not a uniquely Chinese problem. Chinese companies have been at the forefront of facial recognition technology, and that technology has come into a number of areas of public life, showing how intertwined the digital and physical worlds can become. Facial recognition AI is used by traffic cameras and security cameras all over cities. Getting a SIM card requires a facial recognition scan, as does signing up for new internet service. In many workplaces, facial recognition is used for people to clock in and out, and people don't know what the company is doing with that facial recognition data. In Shenzhen and other cities, facial recognition technology is used to identify and publicly broadcast the personal information of rule breakers such as jaywalkers. Also, it is used to identify and send fines by text or social media to those rule breakers. In Xinjiang is where it gets positively dystopian. Facial recognition cameras and regular ID scanning checkpoints allow for the minute tracking of movements. A private company operating in Urumqi was found to have facial recognition records and ID scans for 2.5 million of the 3.5 million inhabitants of the city on an unsecured external hard drive. And it is far from the only security company operating in that city and region. But that's all we have time for now. I hope you found it very interesting. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion ahead. All right, so yeah, thanks everyone. That was a lot, I know, but it's a lot of stuff to jam into 7 minutes. So yeah, I guess let's move forward.
Okay, thank you both of you. Very interesting presentations. Now there is turn for questions and comments from our two discussants, Anja and Anna. And which one of you would like to start?
Okay, maybe I will start, and I would like to thank the authors for very nice articles and presentations. I really enjoyed reading them, and I think that they open up many interesting discussions. I would like to have this commentary section in a quite interactive way and informal way, so that everyone can follow and make comments that they want to. And for that reason, I would like to follow in the way that I will first present some of the ideas that what really inspired me in both articles. And then I would just make one question for each group to answer. They are quite big questions, so we cannot probably like we could continue with this later in some other events too, because they are so inspiring issues. And then I will give floor for Anna for making questions, and then we will open the floor for audience. So first, the article or presentation by Francisco, Marcus, and Will. What I really liked in this article is how you explore the etymological evolution of the concept of extractivism and the developmental trajectories that inform the underlying extractivist logic. It was really fascinating to read your analysis of you were using the Merriam-Webster dictionary, which says that extraction is obtaining by much effort from someone unwilling. And then from Oxford English Dictionary, where it means to take from something of which the thing taken was a part. And from there you end up saying, referring to the article of Ye et al., that this often means that the value generation of extractivism often is temporary, and it results in an inability to sustainably reproduce livelihoods in the affected areas. I think that's a pretty brilliant conclusion. Then you also analyze the forms of extraction and extractivism, concentrating on the parts of action and activism. For some reason, you ended up in concentrating on those movements and those contestations which focus on active rejection or resistance to extractivist logic. I think that's fine, but in empirically, the relationships between extractivism and contestation are fairly heterogeneous and complex. So I would like to hear why you decided to concentrate on this. But my question related to your article, which I think is quite a big question, but it's really interesting and important, is that it relates with conceptual issues. So what is how do you, because you say that the terms extraction and extractivism stand in an ambiguous yet symbiotic relationship. So my question is, how do you consider what is the relationship between extraction and extractivism, and what is the relationship of extractivism with capitalism, and then does your definition of extractivism require that you analyze extractivism from the perspective of world system analysis or world ecology? So this is the question for you. Then I will go for the second article, which is by Chris, Sophia, and Sana. And I think this was a really interesting and innovative article. You analyze the complex webs of extractivism where digital and data extractivisms intersect with natural resource extractivism. And I must say that I have been also a little bit skeptical of expanding the concept of extractivism to whatever kind of areas. But after reading your article, I think you make a very nice work of really trying to connect the issues of how data extractivism interacts and connects with natural resource extractivism, and that's a great job. It really makes sense. You clearly show that the digital realm and the so-called material realm, they are closely interwoven. My question for you, it's not so much perhaps a question, it's more like a comment or looking forward, because I understand that this is like the first step of your mining of this area. So you give many examples, for example, how individual data is mined and used for different kind of commercial purposes and so on. That's great, but I think maybe more important concerning the natural resource extractivism and data extractivism are those examples that you give, that how the whole apparatus involved in how companies, extractive industries, how they classify, survey, codify, map, reserves, resources, deposits, sinks, and all kind of those issues, and how they manage also the issues of knowledge extraction and security issues, controlling issues, disciplining issues, and so on. So I would like to hear more of your ideas how to go forward with this very fascinating topic.
I think we can take reflections from Will and Chris, and then Anna can continue. And at 1:45, I think we need to open discussion for others.
Yeah, I will go from that. Yeah, and some of my questions actually intersect. So
yes, or is it okay? Well,
no, I think it's better to address first Anya's questions.
Great.
Yeah, well, I don't know, maybe I can let one of my co-authors start on this subject as well. I mean, you ask about this relationship between extraction and extractivism, and it sort of came out from I mean, you know, reading a lot of the literature, you see people are using extractivism. They're using extraction. Some people are using extraction and not extractivism, but they're talking about similar processes that people who are using extractivism are. So it's a bit messy, and I think that's where the kind of the impetus to look the etymology, which maybe I'll let Francesco talk about that, because he did a lot of excellent work on this part.
Yeah, thank you, Will. I can indeed answer to the first question. So as Will has said, we found not too much clarity when reading about these two concepts. So our main idea, it was to divide extraction and extractivism, and as it's written in the chapter, extraction is necessary but not sufficient condition to talk about extractivism. Why so? Because where there is extraction, that's not means it is extractivism. And one thing which was not covered in this presentation in details, it was the focus about this noun suffix ism. So this in this suffix we see that how extraction becomes something else, in the sense that this suffix is all about something, how to say, which is organized towards a goal. So the use of extraction organized towards a goal, and this goal can vary. It could be from development to profit, depending in which fields we are looking into. If it's a political regime, if it's just capitalism, or even an ideology or mindset. So with this operation, we thought we could find a higher order explanation, which is not based on instantiations. And this goes to the second question, because capitalism has many of the characteristics which we found in extractivism, but at the same time we have seen that there are some historical experiences, which one example can be Soviet Union. They didn't have a capitalist economy, but at the same time they were putting into practices extractivism. So the idea was to scrap off all the unnecessary, let's say so, conceptual things, to come out with a, if we succeeded or not, to come out with a pure concept that it can be applied in the study of other different things. So of course it has an empirical value in studying historical phenomena as colonialism or capitalism, but it has something more to give, and this is why we did this. So it's not the same thing. They share many things, but it's not the same thing. And we try to have this message going through. So I don't know if someone else wants to add something more specific about this point.
Thank you. Maybe we could discuss or give Chris now turn to reflect on the paper, and we can continue commenting on the chat box for this as well.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot that I can say in here, and thank you so much for the comments, Anya. And I want to say, starting out, that I do definitely understand and appreciate the skepticism of adding in like new varieties of extractivism, and I think it should be something that is, like, rigorously vetted before being generally accepted. And I will be very honest that I'm very skeptical of like Gago and Mazadra mentioned gold farming. I'm kind of skeptical of that. I feel like that's more labor exploitation than extractivism, but I put it in there just because it's something that people are talking about. Or I mean, like, sorry, we put it in there, but it was something that I was kind of interested in. But I mean, I think that this connection of natural resources is a very important and strong one. If you look at like Coldry Mejias's conception of data colonialism, which is a much bigger systemic view, which ties in a lot of these things and ties in like much more on the governmental level and the international level. It's definitely an important aspect, and it's something that when we see the intrusion of data capturing devices into our lives, and especially, and I think one of the interesting things that Coldry and Mejias bring up is we can see the intrusion of data collection devices into completely unnecessary areas. Like, we don't need a smart fridge. A smart fridge doesn't make your food better or colder or anything like that. It just collects data from you and maybe orders milk for you automatically. We don't need, smartwatches. It's nice, I can keep track of my health a bit better, but we don't necessarily need these things. And of course, in another type of digital extractivism, which I do think there is a good argument for, though, again, as not all extraction is extractivism, as Gudina said. I don't think every case of cryptocurrency mining is extractivism, but I think that there are some really good arguments for specific cases out there. And I think it's something I would love to dive into more as an aside, but I think that's even an easier one to connect with natural resource extraction, since it depends so much on large amounts of energy. But I mean, regardless, all of this stuff. I was thinking of that because there was that report and that thing from Cambridge where it's like just Bitcoin mining, not all cryptocurrencies, just one type of cryptocurrency mining uses more electricity per year than Finland. It's absolutely insane. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting things in here. I think one of the, just one quick comment that I would like to make is, because looking at data is so new, because all this is so new, a lot of the literature thus far doesn't really focus on the extraction, and we actually fell into this too. Looking at the uses of the data and the terrifying uses versus honing in on the extraction and the impacts of the extraction. Although, it's spoiler alert, working on that with Sophia for a paper now. But so a lot of different things here. I'm sorry, but yeah, let's cut it there. We can talk more later. Thank you so much for the comments.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Anna.
Yeah, thank you. I will try to be brief, as I see we don't have much time. So thank you for this opportunity to read the chapters. I enjoyed them. And as I'm working in my own postdoctoral project on indigeneity and local relations with extractive industries in the Soviet and post-Soviet Russia, for me, I have been mostly dealing with the notion of extractivism in relation to natural resources. So it was interesting to read about potential applicabilities of the term towards other areas. And I had also a general question on that, on possible benefits and challenges of expanding the notion of extractivism, but it was already partially addressed. And also I had a general comment as well about applicability of the notion of extractivism towards other economical systems. So extractivism and in socialism and in capitalism, whether it's similar or other strong differences, and maybe we can reflect on that. But again, it was partially addressed, and I see actually there is a great podcast on that, and hopefully we can also talk maybe more on that as we have the book presentation in May. So I would like to ask a couple of maybe questions, points of discussion on violence, because I think it's a really interesting issue raised in both chapters. Violence as not a side effect of extractivism, but as a very inherent ontological feature of the concept itself, and very present in different manifestations of extractivism. And for example, I was thinking about violence and resistance, because in one of the chapters, I think in the extraction and extractivism, the authors mentioned that there are different ways of bodily resistance or disruptive actions or protests or, blockades, other forms of resistance towards extractive projects. And then there is a notion that there are also non-violent forms of resistance towards extractivism. So I'm interested, then it means that some forms are indeed inherently violent. And then what if, can we reflect on if violence is such an important feature of extractivism, is it being reflected in the resistance movements as well? Can we say that? Is it somehow present there too? So is it so visible in every manifestation of extractivism? And then also in relation to that, I have a question on data violence concept. And yeah, it was interesting for me to read on that because I was just writing a paper on care, and I went across several papers on caring about data and caring about technology. And then I was wondering, can we say that this caring about data and violence of data are kind of maybe two sides of the same coin? So maybe two manifestations of emotional relations towards data or towards technology. Because as I see in many aspects, this care and control, care and surveillance are indeed interrelated. For example, the systems ask us whether we want to get the most relevant ads. So it's presented as a sign of care. So do you want to see the ads that are especially important for you, or do you want to see just random ads? So, and then we are tempted to select, for example, that we want relevant ads. So yes, we want this sign of care towards us, but then it's kind of control as well. So we get our data extracted. So maybe we can also talk about that a bit. But yeah, thank you. I see, yeah, we're running out of time.
Go ahead. Thank you, Anna. Very good, interesting questions.
Yeah, maybe I don't know if maybe Sana or Sophia want to jump in to talk about any of this, but I think maybe one like maybe in considering, like, let's say, ongoing extractivist projects. I mean, I think one thing to consider is that, you know, if you are looking at let's say extractivism in sort of its more well-known form in these like natural resource extractivisms, for example, if you simply consider violence or destruction beyond humans, it's impossible to deny that that's possible, whether it's in a monoculture, whether it's blasting the side of a mountaintop and the you know, niche ecologies that are living on those mountaintops or valleys, or, you know, I think there are many ways to kind of you know, and that's even just besides the removal of the forceful removal of people from their lands or their livelihoods, for example. So yeah, just I'll add that, and if anybody else wants to jump in.
I see Sana.
Yes.
Her hand.
Yeah, if you have for this, go ahead, and then we have two asks from Teivo and Jean-Pierre from audience. So, but go ahead, Sana.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Will and Chris for doing the amazing presentations on our behalf. That was a really important point, I think, that Will made to Anna's question about how the violence in extractivism becomes super evident when you expand the concept of violence also to non-human nature, and that's important in a way also in understanding there are these important conceptual takeaways of going beyond the ways of how we're talking about extraction and extractivism, and that's a little bit that I wanted to talk about related to Anya's question, how it's so different if you talk about extractivism or extraction as an act or a practice rather than an ism, a structural systemic paradigm where, for example, the data extractivism, then there are a lot of great arguments for including it into the conversation or not, but it's pretty evident when you understand it from the structural point of view that it is part of this total extractivism following Dunlap and Jacobsen, and especially from the point of view of violence, the social pacification that we talked about in the chapter is super important part of this, and especially when you understand that everything has a material foundation and that these data extractions are not immaterial, but they are very much rooted into the earth and the world around us, as well as the monocultures and all the other natural resources that you talk about. And it's super important also related to the Anja's question about extraction and extractivism, is that everyone in the world, or pretty much everyone in the world right now, especially in the modern societies, are somehow intertwined, or extractivism is affecting their lives, even though they're not extractivists themselves. That there is a big difference between, for example, Monsanto and the farmer who is forced to use the products, or a technology user and the corporations who are making these products or these algorithms or using the data. But because it is about extractivism, they are still part of this world systemic, world ecological environment and environments making processes. And I think that's kind of the big takeaway I'd love to give from these chapters that we have, that even though now I'm derailing, but yeah, stopping now. Thanks.
Thanks, Sana.
If I can just address Anna's question very quickly.
Yeah, sure.
Just very quickly. I mean, I hadn't heard of the term of data care before. And it sounds interesting, although like the description of like, do you want to see the most relevant ads for you, sounds like, just a way of, making it sound nicer. Like, oh, we're taking your data and we could be selling it on to people, we'd be doing whatever, but like, it sounds nicer. I think this is often, again, I hadn't heard this term and I'm curious to hear more about it and check it out. But I think of a lot of a relation to like a colonial mentality with like, yes, we're like, colonialism is often presented in a very positive light, or at least it was during the time. It's like, we are here, we are doing civilizing things. Look how look how nice we are for you. We're caring. We're doing this because we care about the rest of the world. Obviously, don't look at what we're doing with all the things. So I mean, I think of that connection, but I guess it all comes down to like how your data is protected, and I think how things are built. I mean, because not all technology is bad, not a Luddite, but there are a lot of issues, especially in this connected to like, the underlying architecture, the fact that like people building these things don't have social science backgrounds, don't understand that numbers are interpreted and created by people, and they themselves can be racist and biased and things like that. So there's a lot of these different things, and I think that data can, like, there is a possibility to use data in very positive and caring ways, but you have to be able to protect people. So that's my very quick thing, but I'd love to talk about more later.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, both of you. We have few questions from audience. I think Deivainen asked and turn, and then Jean-Pierre also. But Deiva.
Thank you. Excellent, fascinating stuff. I think Chris partially reflected on what I was going to ask. So just briefly, the data colonialism, data extractivism. And Chris, you also pointed to this labor exploitation, and to what extent, like, I recommend you, it will be available soon, I think yesterday in Helsinki, in Equality Initiative of our university. There was a talk by Gorminder Pambra, who used the term relations of extraction to refer to how through taxes, rent, and other mechanisms, resources were transferred from India to the island British Isles, and so it's rent, taxes, labor exploitation. To what extent is extractivism a term to be used there? Another very brief, I think it was Will's a wonderful intervention where you mentioned property. I may have confused which one it was. I think it was yours. This thing, if we assume that extractivism and extraction involves something that has to do with property rights, and many doing political economy would probably assume so, just conceptually, are we thinking, especially in a colonial situation, that it's transforming something that is not property into property, or is it transforming property relations somewhere, perhaps more equal, perhaps less capitalist, into other kinds of property relations. This is a minor conceptual issue in the new political economy journal issue. There's wonderful conversation about that by Tavi Sundell and Mark Devon. So is property like institution of wrong, as Mark Devon would say, or is, yeah, extraction and property?
Does Marcus, do you want to take that? I see your hand up.
Oh yeah, I can say something. So thanks for the comment. So first, for the issue about the definition of extractivism. So I think it also shouldn't go everywhere. And we emphasize in this chapter that there's this interface between maximization and destruction. So you should study both at this drive of maximizing the benefits, like profits, or some other things, and then the destruction that causes. So if you take some examples, for example, from the Soviet Union, they might have not been so much dialed into maximization, but might have caused a lot of destruction. So there's different, I would say there are different degrees to extractivism that need to be studied and explained in different sectors. And you have to look at the pace and scale. And for example, Gudinas has 500 years study of extractivism in Latin America in different phases or stages, how it has been, depending on the era. And I would say that the definition presented in that chapter is very broad, so it can be applied quite broadly. It's not only world system or world ecology. So about property, I think there's like an assumption that there's the right to extract. So that's kind of linked to property. And there's a great new book called Property is Theft, by Nichols, and that book says that, for example, such concepts as dispossession are actually modern and Western, and they don't describe the situation as it was, for example, 500 years ago in the Americas, because the people there didn't consider that they would own the land, that they didn't have this Western understanding coming from the Anglo-American perspective that you could own a land or own a piece of land, and then you could be dispossessed. So it's better to use the term enclosure to avoid to being within the ontology of extractivism when you're actually analyzing things where people resisting that don't live within that ontology.
Yeah, and I think that for me, what was really interesting is that because as Marcus says, this concept of property that we understand as in the West is not, there's nothing universal about it. And that's why I've even been thinking more and more about this concept of property as it was sort of brought in ancient Rome, that there was already this that concept of property is from that era, and it was not necessarily common in that era. That there weren't Greece was an exception to that, and it's become a this universal thing because it's been kind of come down to us from that. But again, yeah, the idea to sort of explode the notion of property itself, I think is important, and I would be interested to get that what you mentioned, the discussion about property that you recently mentioned.
Thank you. We have at least one more question from Jean-Pierre.
Yes, hi everybody. I hope you can hear me. Thanks for this wonderful work. I'm very glad to hear that such an initiative exists and is embedded at the University of Helsinki. I really like that you're going back to the writings of ancient empires that influence our cultures and to see where those thoughts are coming from. And I have two questions that are interrelated somewhere to that. And the first one is, when you defined for yourself extraction and extractivism, did you ever ponder on how far that is actually different from what else is going on in the natural world, such as that all living beings are dependent on extracting nutrients from the ground for the metabolisms to function. Or also if you think of some, well, ant colonies in general, actually, but also some species of them who are known to colonize other species again to extract resources from them, and then how far we humans are actually different. And the second part to that is whether you found when reading in particular through writings from, well, ancient times, any argumentations about why humans are different with regards to, well, concepts that are relevant here, maybe even property, the idea of property. I don't know who can answer this actually. Maybe somebody just wants to try.
Well, I can say something, so thanks. So I think, first of all, it's good to understand that they are like, it's important to emphasize the relations and the balance. And with extractivisms, we mean something that it's not in balance, it's causing imbalance in the system, in the systemic way. Whereas if you have like a setting with a lot of different life forms, like in a rainforest, they support each other. There's like those entities are related to each other. So if you have that kind of like usage of nutrition by some species, then it's normally returning back, and there's a delicate balance between them. We studied, for example, what ecofeminists like Merkant have said about these things, and there's like a very different way in medieval times or in Rome how the earth was conceptualized and understood. So there's more in the chapter, but just a quick note on that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think also, like, you know, you bring up the example of ants, but you know, I kind of also like the example of mycelium, of mushrooms. I mean, mushrooms are very reciprocal with their relations of trees, for example. They're not. I remember listening to this podcast, and the guy was interviewing some mycologists, and the guy said, "Well, what stops them from taking over?" And that's the wrong question. The point of, they're not trying to take over. They're trying to maintain a kind of relation that creates a kind of, you know, there's a tree is getting nutrients and a mushroom is continuing to grow. And I think that there shouldn't necessarily be any one thing in nature that we look to as an example, like to say, to, you know, kind of project or anthropomorphize, you know, onto humans. But I think there are a lot of inspiring ways to kind of consider what relations can be out there.
Thank you. I think we are running out of time, and 1 hour was definitely not enough. You can see in the chat box that there are several events will come on book launch as well. And we can also continue. There is a Teams group for HELSUS members. We can also continue discussion there. But now I'd like to thank all the presenters and discussants for a very intriguing session. And I think it was a kind of a first launch for many of us who are not yet familiar of extractivism and all the research that goes around it. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and see you next time.